Hi, this video is to look a little bit deeper into a capital budgeting example and determine which inputs affect NPV and which affect IRR. I've already set up the structure of the model, so hit pause if you'd like to recreate it with me. Our initial investment is $1,000, and I'm assuming that's at time zero, so I'm just going to come down here and refer to that cell. For our revenues, I've made it simple and said that they're all going to be equal to this cell in annual revenue per year. So I'm going to hit F4, and then I can hit Control Enter and populate all those at once. I'm going to do the same thing with annual expenses, which are in C8. I'll hit F4 and Control Enter. Now for depreciation, to keep it simple at this part of the video, I said let's just hard code it on a 10-year straight line. So that means for each year I could take the investment, have to lock that cell, and divide it by 10. I might want to make that negative as well. Oh, it's going to be negative because the investment's negative. So I'll hit Control Enter, and notice that if I come down here, hit Alt equals, then we are recovering our full $1,000. Alt HBP to get a border on top of that. I'm just going to put that sum cell across all these columns. And then for taxable income, our taxable income doesn't include the investment, right? The taxing authorities aren't going to let us write off that entire investment in the first year. So it's just going to be the sum of the revenue less the expenses less the depreciation. So we're going to spread that investment out over 10 years as far as the taxing authorities are concerned. So we made $200. We actually brought in $500, paid out $200 in expenses, and then paid out $100. Didn't really pay it out because it's non-cash, but we charged ourselves a portion of the investment in that first year. So our taxable income is $200. Highlight that, Control D, and then our taxes are going to be 20% of that number. Since they're an outflow, I am going to put a negative in front of that formula. Control D, and that makes it look like I should have used an absolute reference up there to the tax rate. So I'll come back at F4. Now that I've got that formula like I like it, and I happen to have all these cells highlighted, this time Control Enter will copy that down and enter it in all the cells. Now my after-tax income, let's think about this. Income, again, sort of suggests that it includes this non-cash item. I'm going to differentiate that in this video from after-tax cash flow. You may be saying, well, those aren't the same columns you had in the other capital budgeting videos. If you go out and look at commercial software, everybody has slightly different columns here to show what they think is important, but the logic is the same. Revenue is always an income, expenses and depreciation always take away from the taxable income, although depreciation is always non-cash, and so forth. I'm repeating myself, so I'll just get on with it. So my after-tax income, in this case, is just going to be what was my taxable income less the taxes. Copy that down. Double-clicking might work there. Yeah, double-clicking still stopped above my sum. Now let's contrast that to the after-tax cash flow, which is going to be the after-tax income, but we're going to make a correction for, need to add in that investment because that really is cash flow, right? But then I need to take out this depreciation because it's really not cash flow. So while it feels like we made 160 in profit, we actually put 260 in the bank. Why do we have to do that? Because there was this first period up here at time zero. I'm going to copy that out. So we went down to the bank and took out $1,000 so that we could make our initial investment. And at that time zero, we didn't have any revenue, expenses, depreciation, or taxes. And then what happened the next year? Well, we'd like to think that we made 260 because we brought in 500 less 2 less 40, and that's the cash flow. But really, if we're thinking about how profitable is our company, we want to include that non-tax depreciation, non-cash, depreciation. And so really, even though we brought in 260 of cash, we still need to pay for this $1,000 up here. So that's why the after-tax income is a little bit different than the after-tax cash flow. Think of this as your accounting number. Think of this as your cash number. Anyway, back to the purpose of the video. We know that to get the net present value, we're going to take that first cash flow, and to that we're going to add the NPV at a discount rate of all the other cash flows. That's what we call the NPV bug, because it's tempting to just grab that whole column, but we have to take that first times zero cash flow out. That gives us a net present value. And then for the IRR, the rate of return, we're just going to take the whole column and find out what's the discount rate that would set that to zero. If we want to check that, we could do it this way. We could come up here and say goal seek. I like to use Alt-TG, but I think it's in the menu somewhere. Data, what if analysis, and goal seek. We could ask Excel if we wanted to set that net present value equal to 0, not O, 0, by changing the discount rate. What would you have to make that discount rate? Look at that. It got pretty close to 22.62. I bet if I came up here and showed a couple of decimal places, it would be spot on. That's why we say the rate of return is the discount rate that would make NPV equal to 0. Let me go back to my 10% discount rate, and let's look at this another way. What if we said, depending on what our discount rate was, we could have different NPVs and maybe different IRRs. I don't know. Let's see. So let's say we wanted to look at anything from 2%. I'm going to go ahead and step by one here. 2%, 3%, up to 25%. And this is going to be a data table, and those are going to be my input cells. So I'm going to format them as input so I remember what I'm doing here. I want to pull out the NPV and the IRR, and those are going to be my output cells. So I'm going to format them accordingly. And then if I want Excel to plug in that 2% here and show me the 1355 and the 2262, and then plug in the 3% and grab the 1218 and the 2262, I could just do a data table. I could select enough and only enough cells to get the formatted cells from there. Alt-DT, or you could go back through the what if data, what if menu. And I don't have a row input cell, those are outputs, but I do have a column input cell. And what I'd like Excel to do with those is put those numbers one at a time into this cell. And when I do, let me copy this, and I'm going to paste it as a format so we can see that a little better. And then I'm going to copy C1, so I'll just do an Alt-HP, Alt-HO, Alt-HO. And look what happens. That NPV, the higher the discount rate gets, the lower the NPV gets until it hits 0, right around that 2262. But notice that changing the discount rate in this model doesn't change the IRR at all. If you're a picture person like I am, we could select these, Alt-ND, make a chart, right click on the chart, and put those rates of return on the secondary axis so we can actually see the number over here.
All right, so now that we've got our data set up, let's go ahead and start building our dashboard. So first, let's go ahead and create a new tab. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new tab. I'm going to call this dashboard. And then I'm going to go ahead and
Oops, wait just a moment. I said sensitivity of NPV and IRR to rate of return. That's not correct. It's to discount rate. That error is going to be in the rest of the video until you get to the end where I fixed it. Sorry about that. And here's a nice picture that shows that NPV falling off with discount rate, shows IRR remaining constant as discount rate changes, and it shows that NPV hitting zero right around 22.62%. So that's one way to look at it. Actually, two ways to look at it. We did a data table, we did a chart. Before that, we even did a goal seek. I'm going to set that back to 10. Notice that changing this from 3 to 10 won't change anything over here because all of these are based on sensitivities of what's in that cell. So what I type into it doesn't change anything over here. A totally different way to get at these two questions of which affects NPV and which affects IRR would be to pick an input. Go up to formulas and trace what depends on that. So what depends on the investment? Well, the investment in the table. Trace dependence again. It affects depreciation, and it affects that after-tax cash flow. And then it affects anything that depreciation affected, and eventually gets up here to both rate of return and NPV, because both of those looked at this column of numbers. And if I hit it one more time, it even affects my formula text, where I'm showing you what the formula is, and it affects the data table. We won't worry too much about those, but we know that investment affects both of these. That's the key. So let's remove those arrows, and try this again. Hit trace dependence about 5 times. It affects both. Annual revenue, of course it does. Remove arrows. Expenses affect both. And income tax rate affects both. Remove those arrows and let's try the discount rate. It's also an input. Trace dependence. Well, the first thing it affects is the NPV. Trace dependence again. It also affects the formula of the NPV, and it affects what's over here in the data table, and that's all it affects. So it never gets to this rate of return. That was a hard way, a long way to use the formula tracing to find out what affected IRR. A much easier way would have been to start with the outputs. If I start with this output and see what precedes it, I can trace all the way back to all these different inputs, and I see that even discount rate along with these others are precedents that affect the net present value. You can remove those arrows and come to rate of return and trace what precedes that. Only the cash flows. Now, of course, things precede the cash flows, so if I hit precedence again, I get the entire table of cash flows. If I hit precedence again, I get the investment, and I should eventually get things like income tax rate, revenues, and annual expenses. But if I keep pressing it, notice that rate of return, I can trace it all the way back through almost everything on the sheet except for the discount rate input. So hopefully that answered these two questions for you. And hopefully my little typo here, where I said sensitivity to rate of return instead of discount rate, didn't confuse you. Have a great day.